Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Amy Taylor, and I'm an assistant professor with the Earl E. Bakken Center for Spirituality and Healing. I'm a physician who's dual board certified in emergency medicine and integrative medicine, and I'll be your host for tonight's mini medical school for our third and final session in our series, Food, Nutrition, and the Effects of Substances on Health. We're really excited to guide you through our final series topic tonight, understanding different diets, processed foods, nutrition, and disease. We do hope that you were able to join us for our previous week's discussions, but if you weren't, you can still view these discussions on the Office of Academic Clinical Affairs YouTube channel. We'll begin with a moderated discussion, followed by a question and answer series. Please note that you can submit your questions at any time using the Q&A button, which is located at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We will be recording tonight's session, and it will be able to be viewed on the Office of Academic Clinical Affairs YouTube channel, and you'll be sent a link to this through your email. All right, well, let's go ahead and get started. Last week, we had a really invigorating discussion regarding different substances and their effects on health, such as cannabis, psychedelics, opioids, and alcohol. And tonight's discussion will have another wonderful panel of experts who will discuss how you as a consumer can ascertain the different quality of different food and beverages. And with that, it's my pleasure to bring in our first speaker, Ms. Jenny Breen. Jenny is a faculty member at the Earl E. Bakken Center for Spirituality and Healing. She has been a professional chef and advocate for sustainable food systems and food justice, and has worked with farmers and producers in the Twin Cities area since the mid-1980s. She aims to build an understanding of cooking as a health strategy. Her first cookbook, Cooking Up the Good Life, emphasizes local, seasonal whole food cooking for families. Jenny, welcome. Can you please discuss how consumers can assess the quality of food and beverages and help us understand different diets?
Hello, thanks, Amy, for that introduction. I have some slides. I'm going to try and run through these quickly, so hopefully these will get to the answer. You can go to the next one. So I always like to start by saying everyone has a food story. This is something we teach to our future and practicing health professionals. It's important to understand context, where people are coming from, what their culture, tradition, identity is in relation to food. And it gives us a lot of information in guiding people towards making choices. Next slide. This, just for context, this is a reflection of what our current standard American diet is, and I'll just point out that's giant yellow section, what we would now identify as ultra-processed foods. So these are the foods that you wouldn't be able to make or that have ingredients you couldn't find in your own kitchen. So we have a significant portion of our diets going towards these foods right now. Next slide, please. And what's really interesting about that is on the left, you'll see the dietary guidelines, what we suggest and encourage people to eat. But on the right, if you look at the U.S. farm subsidies, what we support, our government supports in terms of production, those little tiny green and yellow slivers are the fruit and vegetable production that is supported. And a more recent statistic I've seen is 1% and 2%. So there's a mismatch between what we're producing, what's available, and what we're suggesting that people should eat. Next slide, please. This is just a really wonderful resource to look at what a balanced diet looks like in terms of human health and in terms of environmental impact. I know you talked about this on some previous weeks, but typically what's good for humans is also good for the planet and vice versa. So really helpful to consider the impacts both internally in terms of people and also the planet, because they're very connected. Next slide. NOVA food classification. So again, we have a new identification as ultra-processed foods. I think other people are going to get into that or have, so I won't stay with that. But there are 4 classifications of foods. The one on the left, the minimally processed foods, is really what we want to emphasize in terms of highest proportion in our diet. We're not quite there yet. Next slide. And what's really important to understand about that is statistics show a 31% higher mortality rate, 50% of the caloric intake of adults and 67% of children's daily calories are coming from highly ultra-processed foods. So it's a very important thing to understand. All calories are not created equal. Our bodies process them differently. Next slide. Go ahead, next slide. There's a connection between the gut and the brain. I won't get into it, but what we put into our bodies also relates not only to our physical health, but to our mental, emotional, spiritual health. All is connected. And that's a physiological, that's evidence-based. We are diving into understanding the gut, but we do know that there is a deep relationship between our brain and our gut. So it all connects. Next slide, please. And here's why. Just another reminder, next slide. I want to talk briefly about the macronutrients. So we often think about carbohydrates as bread and pasta, but everything in this picture is a carbohydrate. All plant foods are carbohydrates. They are the source of fiber in our diet. Incredibly important, significantly important, and people need to understand that. Next slide. What that means is that we're talking about quality carbohydrates. So we're talking about whole versions of these carbohydrates, vegetables, fruits, beans, lentils, even sugar are carbohydrates, but whole versions of those are very different in terms of how our bodies process them. Next slide. So when I use the word quality, that's what I'm talking about. Again, proteins, you can see also very diverse, not just animal proteins. All things have, many things, not all things, but many things have protein, including avocados and broccoli. So our understanding of where protein is found is limited. And again, an argument for diversity in our diets. Next slide. So again, animal proteins on the left, plant proteins on the right, but quality is just means a whole natural versions of those macronutrients. Next slide, please. And finally, fats. As a chef, one of my favorite categories, but also you can see a diverse list here as well. And next slide, when we talk about quality in terms of fats, what we're talking about is naturally occurring fats, meaning fats that come from sources that are fatty. They're not produced in a laboratory, they come from nature, and they can be taken from that plant or that animal naturally. Next slide. Planetary Health Plate. This comes from the Eat Lancet Commission. It's a really wonderful, I think, representation of what's realistic and what can be translated across cultures rather than just a Western perspective on a healthy eating plate. So I think it's a really nice, useful tool. Next slide. What are food skills? So I'm a chef and I teach culinary nutrition. I teach people how cooking is a public health strategy and a strategy for their own health. And that's about food skills. So it's about everything from knowing what to consume, how to plan, procure, prepare food, use your senses, understand food safety and food waste, and fully understand the food system. And this comes from the Canadian Dietary Guidelines. We didn't just make this up. So very important, I think, in the overall pursuit of quality nutrients in our lives. Next slide, please. And some evidence-based information about how cooking at home can benefit your health. So you have control over ingredients, better diet quality, more cost-effective, and it's actually associated with higher food security. Obviously, it can improve digestion, better mental health, community health, teaches skills, fosters connection in your family or household, and overall lower environmental impact. So these are all things that we know from years and years of looking at what happens when people cook at home versus sourcing more of their food from outside the home. Next slide. And then I like to put this in here. This is from an organization called the Ellen Satter Institute. She's all about child feeding and teaching people how to really create healthy relationships and healthy environments with food, especially if they're raising children. I work with a lot of parents and it's complicated for people given our current food system. So I won't read through these, but it's a really wonderful resource and really gives power back to people to have a relationship with food rather than living influenced by rules and lists and diets and that kind of thing. We're all very different and we need to understand what that looks like in our own bodies. Next slide. And mindful eating, as I think I'll end with this. Our physiology is set as it was many, many generations ago for us to be in fight or flight mode, meaning we are not able to really digest or absorb nutrients when we are distracted or when we think we're in danger. And currently in our society, that means being on a screen, or it means driving, or it means being overly stressed. So we can change that. We can go from sympathetic to parasympathetic mode simply by taking 3 deep breaths and preparing to engage with our food in a different way. It tells our body that we are no longer in fight or flight mode, and it changes to parasympathetic. It is an extraordinary tool. It's free. Anybody can do it. And it's a really powerful way to help people reconnect with that relationship with food that we're losing today. I think that might be it for my slides. These are classes that I teach. If anyone wants more information about that, that's fine. I teach in food science and nutrition. I teach through the center, both graduate and undergraduate courses and a CME course for health professionals that I co-teach with an integrative doctor called Food Matters. So I don't know if I have any time to answer your question, Amy, or if that was enough.
No, you did a great job, Jenny, and we'll have more questions for you in the question and answer series in a little bit later in the discussion. And thank you so much for your perspectives on that. I hear from a lot of my patients that they want to eat healthy, but aren't quite sure how to do it because they don't know what to do in the kitchen. They want to eat those fruits and vegetables, but they have no idea how to prepare them. And so I think your culinary literacy and teaching people simply how to cook is so valuable.
Thank you.
You bet. All right, so we're going to move on to our next speaker, Dr. Lynn Steffen. Lynn is a professor in the School of Public Health. Dr. Steffen's research areas and expertise include aging, nutrition epidemiology, diet assessment, and nutrition in older adults. Her recent projects include the study of dietary intake, such as dietary patterns, added sugar, and processed foods. Dr. Steffen, welcome. Can you please talk about processed foods? What does it mean if something is processed?
I can do that. So I actually will be focusing on too much added sugar and salt added to processed foods. So I have no potential conflicts of interest to disclose. So I'd like to discuss these items in my 10-minute talk. So I hope to get to it all. So big changes have occurred in dietary patterns between 1970 and 2014. In 1970, Americans ate on average about 2,000 calories per day. In 2014, calorie intake increased by about 375 calories to almost 2,400 calories a day. And greater calorie intake can be blamed on added sugar, sodium, and fat to the diet. And here's a figure that shows, if you look at the red segment in these circles, added sugar and sweeteners increased by 2014. Also fats increased exponentially, but also grain products increased over between 1970 and 2014, which may account for the increase in calorie intake. So consumers have increased reliance on processed foods. Now, why is this? Since the 1950s, the number of processed foods in the marketplace increased exponentially due to increased consumer demand. Now that demand increased or started to increase mainly because women started joining the workforce. Instead of working only at home, they started working outside the home. So what are processed foods? And so they can be defined as any procedure that also alters the food from its original state. And here's a whole list of actions that can be applied to a food in processing. Even washing of food is called processing. But most importantly, I think formulation or reformulation of a natural food, meaning the addition of other ingredients to food, such as preservative, flavors, nutrients, and other food additives that, of course, are approved by the FDA to add to these food products. But it's the sugar and fat that add calories. Salt doesn't necessarily add calories, but it certainly promotes a chronic disease. So processed foods include packaged or canned foods. A lot of frozen foods can be categorized as processed foods. Foods that you buy in a fast food restaurant or restaurant vending machine coffee shop or street vendors can be called processed. So here's an example. On your left, you see processed foods on, all the shelves in the grocery store. You've got ready-to-eat cereal, you've got your packaged cookies and crackers. I mean, even bakery products in a grocery store are processed. And then, of course, you've got your canned soups or canned vegetables that are called processed. And then on your right-hand side, you've got your minimally processed or unprocessed foods, fruit, vegetables, and meat. Now, the NOVA food processing classification system is the most commonly reported framework. And Jenny actually had a much prettier picture than mine. But in the NOVA processed food category, you have unprocessed or minimally processed on your left-hand side, and on your right-hand side of the table, you'll see this list of foods that can be categorized as minimally or unprocessed foods and beverages. And then you've got processed ingredients. All of these are ingredients that you can make some type of food. Processed foods are foods with limited number of ingredients, typically salt, sugar, or any type of fermentation product for preservation purposes. This would categorize a food as processed. And then, of course, we have the very large category of ultra-processed foods that, as Jenny mentioned, contributes a lot to the American diet. But these foods are, a lot of articles that I've read say that these are very palatable type of foods. Your cakes, your cookies, your pie, your sugar-sweetened beverages, any food that's bought in a restaurant, fast food restaurant. But even some of your commercially made packaged whole grain and refined grain products are classified as ultra-processed. And so here in this table, I show you characteristics of the US population. So there was a Dr. Steele who wrote this paper, and she took Ann Haynes' data, Nutrition, Health, and Nutrition Examination Survey data from 2005 to 2014. And she found that adults eating more ultra-processed foods are younger. Most of the, just a little bit more females are consuming ultra-processed foods, current smokers, and people have a greater BMI who are consuming more ultra-processed foods than those consuming fewer. And also greater UPF intake is related to obesity. Okay, so I'd like to talk about sodium. Now, I think most of you know that sodium or salt intake is related to high blood pressure. The US Dietary Guidelines recommends that people consume 2,300 milligrams of sodium or less per day. And if you have high blood pressure, then you should be consuming less. So here's a list of forms and sources of sodium, including salt. So you have salt-containing seasonings, monosodium glutamate, all types of sodium-containing condiments, ketchup, mustard, mayonnaise, soy sauce, miso, fish sauce. You've got lots of bottled sauces and condiments that have lots and lots of sodium in it. Most canned items have sodium, most frozen food items, and breads, rolls, and tortillas all have lots of sodium in them. So I'd like to briefly tell you about a study that my colleagues and I conducted called this Sources of Salt study. So this is obviously about sources of salt. So we recruited 450 US adult volunteers. They either lived in Alabama, Minnesota, or California. And they were ages age 18 to probably 65, I believe. So we administered 4 24-hour recalls, and we asked them about discretionary salt use. Did they add salt at the table? Did they add salt in cooking? What foods and beverages did they consume? Because we wanted to differentiate naturally occurring sodium in foods from sodium added to processed foods. We also asked about tap water, if they drank it at home, and then we determined, the amount of sodium in their tap water. We also determined sodium in dietary supplements. And lo and behold, we found that the majority of sodium consumed came from processed food sources. 71% of foods that people consumed came from processed foods. And this could be processed or ultra-processed foods. And then I think 5% of sodium or salt was added at the table. 6% of sodium was added in cooking. 14% of sodium was naturally occurring in foods, and only 1% of sodium was found in tap water or dietary supplements. So now let's move on to added sugar. The U.S. Dietary Guidelines recommends 10% or less of added sugar consumed per day. So what is sugar? So we've got naturally occurring sugar, which is found in whole fruit, vegetables, or milk products. And then we've got sugar added to foods during processing or food preparation or added at the table. And so all sugars are carbohydrate, and they contain 4 kilograms per gram or 4 kilocalories per gram of food or beverage. For example, a sugar sweetened beverage contains about 250 calories in a 12-ounce serving. So who adds the sugar? So we add 25% of sugar to our foods. The other 75% comes from processed foods. And here's a list of the top sources of added sugar in US adults. And this again came from the Ann Haynes survey, but in years 2017 to 18. And not surprising, sugar sweetened beverages contributes almost 38% of added sugar to the total added sugar intake. And then comes sugar sweetened coffee and tea, bakery products, sugar, condiments, candy, other desserts such as, your dairy desserts, ice cream, pudding, that sort of thing, ready-to-eat cereals, bread, rolls, and tortillas. And then altogether, added sugar contributes almost 400 calories per day to our diet. So added sugar is related to chronic disease. So I mentioned that sodium or salt is related to high blood pressure, but not surprising, added sugar is also related to chronic disease. And so here's a study that one of my students conducted using the Cardia study. We found that adult men and women who consumed 10% or more calories from added sugar gained more weight over 30 years compared to those who consume less than 10% from added sugar. So in the same study, in similar study population, more added sugar consumed was related to greater volumes of pericardial fat, and this is fat around the heart, as well as visceral fat, and which visceral fat is in the abdominal region. And as you can see from the figure, it's really kind of a dose-response relationship. And so with increasing added sugar, you accumulated more fat. And finally, this study was again using Ann Haynes data, where this investigator looked at added sugar consumed related to greater risk of dying from cardiovascular disease. And as you can see in model 2, people had almost 3 times risk of dying from heart disease if they consume more than 25% of calories from added sugar. So the bottom line is greater added sugar intake is related to increasing pericardial fat and increased risk of developing obesity and dying from heart disease. So what should we eat and drink? Well, the FDA designed a new food label. And so the food label on your right is the current label. And so, excuse me. So the serving size for this food is 2/3 cup, and the number of calories in one serving is 230 calories. And right below the 230, you'll see percent daily value. So that's the new addition to a facts panel. And the daily value is important because the FDA selected foods with less than or equal to 5% daily value for sodium and added sugar as being more healthy than those foods with greater than 5% of daily value. And so you can see from this nutrition facts panel, the sodium is 160 milligrams for one serving of this food, but the daily value is 7%. And then for added sugar, we have 10 grams of added sugar, but the daily value is 20%. Now, if there was no added sugar in this product, I would say, well, 7% isn't that far away from 5%. So maybe it's an okay product to buy. However, given that the added sugar is 20% daily value, I would bypass this product and go find a healthier product to purchase. And this last slide, I'd like to have you pay attention to the website, myplate.gov. Myplate.gov has many interactive activities at the website, where the website helps the individual plan healthy meals. And so perhaps if you've got your computer in front of you, after my talk, of course, you can go to myplate.gov and just see what's on this website. So important points to consider when selecting foods or eating foods is to eat fewer processed foods and more fresh and whole foods, which Jenny actually pointed out too. And I highly recommend reading the nutrition facts panel and to look at the percent daily value on that facts panel, especially for added sugar and sodium. And a good reason to reduce added sugar and sodium and processed foods intake is that these are related to chronic disease. And here's some websites for healthy eating patterns. It's the Dietary Guidelines for Americans, myplate.gov. And the bottom one is from the US News and World Report website, where they actually rank different diet patterns. And the best diets, and actually have been consistently the best diets for the last 5 or 6 years, are the Mediterranean diet and the DASH diet, and I think the DASH Mind or the Mind diet. Anyway, I highly recommend that you go visit these websites. And thank you. And I guess we'll take questions after.
Yes. All right. Thank you so much, Lynn. That was really helpful information and also helped tie in some previous discussions we've had on the importance of eating whole, unprocessed foods. The Mediterranean diet encompasses this really well. We talked about that in our first session of mini medical school, and such an important topic, also understanding processed foods. I'll share a technique I sometimes share with my patients. An easy way to remember what might be processed is to remember the big C's: cookies, candy, crackers, chips, cola or pop, or cold cuts or deli meats that you put on a sandwich. If you kind of remember these, it doesn't encompass everything that's processed, but if you kind of remember those big C's and try to limit them as much as possible, you'll be on your way to eating a diet that doesn't have a lot of processed food. All right, so let's move on to our next speaker. I'm going to bring in Dr. Chi Chen. Dr. Chen is a professor in the Department of Food Science and Nutrition in the College of Food, Agricultural, and Natural Resource Sciences. His research aims to understand the intricate details of how different challenges of factors, including diet, chemicals, microbes, and pathophysiological conditions, can affect metabolic processes. Dr. Chen, welcome. Can you please talk about food safety?
Sure. one thing I want to mention, when we're talking about food safety, usually we are talking about, in the scientific term, mostly we're talking about microbiome safety in a way. Just say you have a pathogenic microbiomes contaminates in food. But in my case, I want to talking about something which is another category, which is the chemicals. In this case, I call non-nutrients in foods, and which is this topic is heavily related to both Jenny and Lynn presented previously on the processed food. Yeah, so I want to elaborate what's mean non-nutrient and also explain briefly on how our body handle them. So first of all, it's talking about the my slides were stuck. Okay, yeah. So first of all, I want to just quickly define a non-nutrient. So to define a non-nutrient, we need to define the nutrient first. So this is the definition in this popular website, so Wikipedia, right? So nutrient we usually we talking about is the substance used by the organism to survive, grow, and reproduce. So commonly we're talking about macronutrient, micronutrient, including the proteins, fats, carbohydrate, vitamin, and mineral. But if you look at the definition by the National Institute of Health, and which it has an office of the dietary supplements, and they have a broader definition, which is talking about everything make your body to function properly. And this is a broader. So then after define a nutrient, then the non-nutrient, it's everything else. So that's an easy way to define the non-nutrients in our food. So I want to use these slides to explain where those non-nutrients are coming from. And so I use this picture to highlight the flow of food, which has these basic steps. First of all, you have a raw food materials, and afterwards you have to prepare it, and then we consume it. All right, so within these three steps, so we can all introduce the non-nutrients into our bodies. So I quickly explain what's that mean. And firstly, these are raw food materials. As we are looking into, we eat animal food, we eat plant-based food. We also eating mushroom, right? We taking yogurt. So those are coming from fungus and also bacterial fermentation. And so those raw food material, one way or another, contain non-nutrients. The major source for non-nutrient in our diet is coming from so-called plant secondary metabolites. Like for example, the pigments, the color, you eating vegetable, they have a different colors, right? So mostly those colors are non-nutrients for you. And then when we talk about animal-based food, like the muscles from animal for human consumption, we do have some concern sometimes with regarding to the chemical residues. For example, antibiotics residue in the food. And then mycotoxin is the toxin produced by the fungus. So they can all present directly in the human food or indirectly as a contaminant. For example, like residue in the food storage periods. And with regarding to food preparation, so this is one category heavily related to the, we just discussed processed or ultra-processed food, right? So besides that, we have a category called food additive and also have a food contact substance, which can also adding into the foods. And but one thing I want to mention is food additive and food contact substance, both are regulated. And so they do have a very strict quality control with regarding to the food preparation process. are mandated by the FDA. But the bottom one, as I mentioned here, so-called newly formed chemical from the food preparation. So this is something which is not regulated and which happen every day in your kitchens. When you when you're doing barbecue, you will get new chemicals from that cooking process, which is does not exist in your raw food materials. And the last category, which is maybe a little bit tricky one, is talking about if you overconsume the nutrients. In those cases, you could potentially partially convert those nutrients to the non-nutrient. A good example is alcohol. If you're drinking a glass of wine, in that case, that alcohol, your body is in the quantity your body can handle easily. So it can provide the energy to your body and also could have some a light impact on your cardiovascular system. But if you consume too much, then the alcohol can be converted into the non-nutrient, which can do damage to your body. Same for the sugars. Yeah. So I want to move into this slides was to discuss how our body handled the non-nutrients. Right? So the handling process is basically a process to moving the non-nutrients from the site of exposure. In the case of the human eating dietary, is mostly coming from your mouth. Right? So you eat it, you get into your oral cavity, and at the end of it, if they have effects, so-called site of action, it can be the beneficial effect, could be the negative effects. So then there has to go through this movement, right? So what you see here from this picture, just say you will have a certain dose of this non-nutrient at exposure site, and afterwards to have a biological effect, they will reach into the certain concentration at your target site. The site of target could be your brain, could be your heart, could be your liver, could be your muscle. Okay. Then within those individual tissue organ, you have cells, and then you have specific intracellular organelles. In that process, the movement process, so those non-nutrients can change from the original form to the ultimate forms. So the ultimate form is the form really that does matter, right? So that process require a so-called disposition process. We call the ADME, means the absorption, distribution, metabolism, excretion. So I quickly use this slide to explain what that means. So absorption, you just say you eat food, so the food has to be absorbed, moving into the blood. And the distribution means the non-nutrient has to move from blood to the site of action. Metabolism means your body will actively transform those chemicals. And then excretion is the chemical being removed from the body, right? So this is some notes, which is we don't have to discuss here, but more or less we just say the ADME is not necessary to be a sequential event. Sometimes the metabolism can happen before the distribution, yeah. But absorption and excretion is always the first step and the last step, respectively. So one thing I want to use this slide to explain what are the difference between the nutrient and non-nutrient with regarding to how body handle it, right? So both body handle this nutrient and non-nutrient, they all use this ADME process, but with the different purpose. So that was something you need to thinking about when you're taking dietary supplement. Most of the dietary supplement are non-nutrients. So the body handle them differently from how body handle the eggs and rice or anything you're taking. Okay, so I want to use this table to quickly explain that. So macronutrient, I use the glucose example. For example, eating rice, so that requires digestion, and then you also use very specific transport process. But then when you're taking, for example, a green tea polyphenol supplement, then you don't need digestion, and then you are using very non-specific way to get into the body. In this case, we call it diffusion, which is basically moving from high concentration to low concentration. And then distribution. So when you take in macronutrient that goes to every part of the body in these cases, or when you take in non-nutrient, in many cases, they're enriching certain organs. Yeah. Then the metabolism, as I just mentioned, it is the conversion process, biotransformation process. Macronutrient, like nutrient inside the body, it is handled by very specific enzyme. Body has designed those enzymes and a pathway to handle it. But then with regarding to non-nutrient, body uses some general mechanism to handle that. And also those events happen in different locations. Lastly, a big difference between the nutrient and non-nutrient is the nutrient body try to keep it. Okay, so for example, in the kidney, body try to uptake it, and then for the non-nutrient, body try to get rid of as soon as possible. So everything in this picture, if it didn't function correctly, then you could run into troubles. So this is something which I would like to know. Lastly, I just want to use this picture, just say to explain there's a good non-nutrient and a bad non-nutrient. So for example, you take in dietary supplement, in many cases, they should be considered as a good non-nutrients for you. So how do you define what's the bad, what is good? You're just using this so-called dose response curve. Okay, so if you're talking about bad non-nutrient, so this case we just say you only have this so-called cutoff between the no effects and toxic effects. If that threshold is very low, then you will get toxic effects very quickly in a sense. But as regarding to the good non-nutrient, then the picture here is basically you will have a non-effects dose. You will have a very broad beneficial dose. But if you overdose it, you may potentially run into toxic ranges. Yeah. So this is a general picture I would like to presenting here, which is I'm not using specific case because there's so many non-nutrient. Everything has every non-nutrient has their way to affect our bodies. Yeah. So, but you can use the information here as a principal information or background information when you consider those non-nutrient factors in your food and your life behaviors. Okay, yeah, I stop my presentation here.
Okay, thank you so much, Chief, for that really detailed and thorough explanation. We really appreciate your expertise. We are now going to move on to the question and answer series. And our first question is going to be for Jenny. How can I make lifestyle changes in the face of convenient and processed cheap food versus wholesome, slower to prepare food?
That may be the number one question that I always get. It is, it's a choice, it's intention, it's prioritizing, it's a skill. And so what that means is learning how to procure affordable ingredients. Whole foods are actually not terribly expensive when you bring them home and prepare them yourself. So it's a long-term investment. We always teach people that you have to sort of look at prioritizing what are you spending your money on, where can you move things around. So food is one thing, but there's a lot of things that we choose to spend our money on that we maybe could move around. Moving meat away from the center of our plate can give us some resources to put towards other things like whole grains and vegetables and legumes and other things that are actually very affordable. There's good evidence to show that cooking at home is really the thing that saves you money. And so it does mean committing to that, and it means being intentional. And I think that is honestly as hard. It's more expensive in time often than it is in money. And so I think people have to just kind of reconfigure the way they're thinking about it. Convenience food is cheap. surprisingly not as cheap as we think. And what we pay for is our health. So it's actually very expensive.
Very, very well said, Jenny. I think you're right on the mark there. And something that I've sometimes shared with patients is when you just feel overwhelmed, I want to eat better, but I don't know where to start, is start with one small change.
Absolutely.
One thing. Master it and then kind of move on. I remember I didn't grow up knowing how to cook. I didn't learn how to cook until I was in my early 30s. And the first thing I did was learn how to roast vegetables. Just chop them up, olive oil, a little salt and pepper in the oven, and you've got a nice vegetable dish. Starting small.
If you do that every day, that's fine. It doesn't have to be something fancy and different and new. Yes, I agree. One step at a time. You start with one thing and you move on from there. And building skills and confidence is a really big part of that. And that's my job.
Absolutely. All right, so we'll move on to our next question. This is for Lynn. How is processed food linked to disease?
Well, that's actually my grant that I'm working on right now. So, contact me in 2 years and I'll let you know. So processed food, according to N. Haynes, 50-60% of calories that people consume comes from this ultra processed foods, i.e. too much salt, too much added sugar. I didn't talk about fat just because in the 1970s and 80s, we were on this low fat diet kick. And then all of a sudden we had an epidemic of obesity. So I don't think that fat intake is our problem. It's maybe the type of fat. But added sugar is clearly an issue, as well as sodium intake. More sodium is related to high blood pressure. High blood pressure is related to congestive heart failure, and it's also related to heart disease. So reducing sodium intake to the recommended amount, whether if you don't have high blood pressure, lower your level to 2,300 milligrams a day is my suggestion. If you have high blood pressure or congestive heart failure, then you should be talking to your dietitian. But I want to say that maybe the goal is 1,600 or 1,800 milligrams a day if you've got high blood pressure or chronic disease. But, so how is it, what's the pathway at this point? I don't know what the pathway is. That's what my study is all about, is looking at the pathway between intake and development of disease. So there's all this that happens in between that we're not real clear about. Now, the added sugar issue. So added sugar has been known to be related to reduced muscle mass and as well as increased adipose tissue. So and it's also related to insulin resistance. So we know that in the muscle is actually responsible for our insulin sensitivity. So if we're reducing muscle mass, we're reducing insulin sensitivity and increasing insulin resistance, which is a precursor to type 2 diabetes and to heart disease. I'm not sure about blood pressure, but added sugar has also been related to development of high blood pressure. But that is too much, excess intake. So the dietary guidelines, and I always go back to the dietary guidelines because we always want some sort of cut point. So if a person is consuming, if the recommended amount of calories per day that person should consume is like 2,000 calories, then 10% of calories can be allotted to added sugar, or less, actually. And as I mentioned in my talk, one serving of a sugar-sweetened beverage is 250 calories. So if you're, supposed to only consume 200 milligrams or calories of added sugar, then you're already over when you're consuming this one serving of sugar sweetened beverages. And the thing of it is, with added sugar and with sodium, is that it's hidden. You don't really know the amount that's in a food, per serving, which is why I suggested, which is why I showed you the nutrition facts panel. When you're grocery shopping, look at this nutrition label or nutrition facts label to find out how much added sugar or sodium, how many calories are actually in this serving of food that you're going to purchase. And if the percent daily value is beyond the cut point that the FDA suggests, I suggest finding a healthier choice. So I'm not sure if I answered the question.
Can I comment? Am I allowed to make a comment?
Yeah.
Go back to the original question that you asked me around quality. I think that's a really useful way of thinking about this, because honestly, I'll say two things that I teach or don't teach. I don't really teach people to count calories, and I don't teach them to look at nutrition labels. I teach them to look at ingredient lists.
Good idea.
Ideally, to buy foods that don't have ingredient lists. So there's a whole sort of layer of quality that can really help people get away from trying to see this as a math problem. It's not ever going to work out if we try and make it a math problem. It needs to be something that someone can do and integrate into their lifestyle, and that nourishes them not just with calories, but with satisfaction. And all of that really points to just whole foods in diverse forms. So yes, of course, it's important to sort of understand these general frameworks, but my experience in 25 years of teaching and working in the food and nutrition space is that it's really hard for people to understand how to eat by doing math. And so the more we focus on food.
But when they're grocery shopping, it's easy to look at a food label.
Absolutely. And ideally, buy foods that you recognize and that you know what they are.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. That reminds me of Michael Pollan's book that he wrote, and I can't remember the name of it, where he said that if you can't pronounce the word, don't buy it. The word in the ingredient list.
And if it's not something your grandmother would recognize as food, I think it's called food rules.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I thought that was very good advice.
All right. Thank you both so much for that input and expertise. Both really appreciate your perspectives. All right, we're going to move on to our next question. This is for Chi. What is the best way to wash veggies? How do you determine if you've washed produce effectively?
Wash veggie. One thing I see was just say this is related to the microbiome safety of the food. So surely we do have cases of those salmonella and E. coli contamination in the food, and I don't see. I think the best way, in my view, just you cook them. So in a way, surely that won't be works for if you take in the salad, and in those cases, then you just make sure those are properly cleaned and potentially remove all those the microbiome contaminations in the food. Again, this is a category which is leading to many of the, especially gastrointestinal disease, but that's different from what I talking about the non-nutrients. Those non-nutrients are absorbable content. The contaminated bacteria usually does not get inside your body. They pass through and stay in your gastrointestinal tract. Right? So, but the non-nutrient can get into the inside of the body, can affect the brains, the muscles, the livers, all those places, cardiovascular system. Yeah. So I guess I don't have a good answer for that. At least I just want to distinguish this is different from the non-nutrients I mentioned in my talks.
Okay, thank you for that. We'll move on to our next question. This is for Jenny. Are foods from farmers markets really better for you?
Oh, I would never make a claim like that. I think it's really dangerous to go down that path. But what I can say from a food systems perspective is the more that I can know about where my food comes from and how it's produced and what's going on behind the scenes, the better informed I am as a consumer. And I can do that at a farmer's market. So that's the main reason that I shop at farmers markets, and also because I know that food is really, really, really fresh. Again, I would just say what's better for you is food that is closest as possible to its whole form and a diversity of foods. And beyond that, there's a lot of nuance and there's a lot of specifics, and there's issues related to things like social determinants of health and food access. So I don't tell people where to shop. I don't tell them what to buy. I give them a lot of information so that they can make really informed decisions. But I love shopping at farmers markets. I love knowing the people in my community who are growing my food. I like my money going back into that community. So there's lots of good reasons to shop at farmers markets.
I absolutely agree. Well said, Jenny. All right, this next question is for Lynn. What would you say to someone who says, well, most recalls are related to leafy greens. Am I better off eating cookies and other processed foods all day?
So the question is, can I eat my cookies too? Okay, I have 2 children. They're adults now, but I made chocolate chip cookies when they were little. But I added nuts and I added wheat germ or whatever that I had in the cupboard, whole wheat flour, so that they were healthier chocolate chip cookies compared to what I might buy at the grocery store. And this was like years ago. So I'm not opposed to eating chocolate chip cookies or any kind of cookies for that matter. I think it's fine, but limit the number of cookies that you're eating, and I would like to say per week. I don't think people need to eat sweets every day. But yes, and then eat your minimally processed or whole foods every day. Eat a healthy diet, fine. Have dessert or have your cookie, that's fine. But cut down. NHANES, as I mentioned, and the NHANES survey is conducted every year. And the last few NHANES surveys have shown that 25% of calories come from snack foods, whether they're rich in added sugar or they're salty snacks. So again, fine, have your cookie, but limit the number. You don't need 25% of your calories coming from snack foods. You need to, what the dietary guidelines recommend, consuming a nutrient dense diet, not a calorically dense diet.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that. I believe we might have time for one brief question. This goes to you, Chi. Is air frying at home considered an okay way of cooking?
I would, the one difference between the air frying or regular frying is the oil mediums, right? So if you use the oil for the frying process can generating like oil frying process, like you're doing the French frying, you can generate lots of, which in my slides called the newly formed chemicals. Many of them are quite reactive. So in that way, large quantity of consumption can do damage to the body. So in that way, basically say air fry reduce the usage of those mediums to forming those reactive chemicals. Surely it can reduce the exposure of those reactive chemicals. So in that way, which is in principle, they should be better. But another kind of a caveat, just say you may reduce the flavor of your food. So that's kind of things which you should expect. Yeah.
All right, well, we are out of time. I want to thank our panelists for their time, their knowledge, and their expertise. And you, our audience, for have willingness and interest in participating in mini medical school. We do hope you enjoyed it, and we hope you'll join us again in future sessions. Thank you so much and have a great night.